For nearly 80 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls have existed in a strange space between certainty and doubt. They were never questioned as real. Their authenticity was never the problem. What haunted scholars, theologians, and historians was something quieter and more dangerous. Timing, when exactly these texts were written, how close they were to the events, beliefs, and people they described, and whether the Bible, as later generations received it, had drifted too far from its origins. That question has followed the scrolls since the moment they were pulled from the caves near the Dead Sea in the late 1940s. Fragile fragments, cracked parchment, ink faded by centuries of desert air. From the beginning, everyone agreed on one thing. These were the earliest surviving texts of the Hebrew Bible ever found, older than any manuscript known before. But agreement ended there. The dates were debated. The margins were wide. Some texts were placed centuries away from their presumed authors. Others were surrounded by uncertainty so large that conclusions became guesses. For decades, those guesses hardened into accepted timelines. Paleography, the study of ancient handwriting, became the primary tool. Scholars examined letter shapes, spacing, stroke angles. They compared scripts across fragments and matched them to known styles. Later, radiocarbon dating was introduced, promising scientific precision. But even that carried a hidden flaw. In the 1950s, many scrolls had been treated with castor oil to make faded ink easier to read. It worked visually. It also contaminated the parchment. Carbon dating relies on purity. The oil distorted results. Dates drifted later than they should have. And once those dates entered academic literature, they stayed there. The scrolls themselves said nothing. They waited. Decades passed. Interpretations grew comfortable. The assumptions settled in that many biblical texts were copied long after their original composition, that the distance between author and manuscript was too wide to bridge. And then artificial intelligence entered a field that had barely changed since the mid-20th century. At the center of this shift was Professor Mladen Popovic from the University of Groningen. Instead of asking what the scrolls said, he asked something more basic. What if we had misunderstood when they were written, because we had never properly cleaned the evidence? His team began by doing what earlier researchers could not. They removed the old contamination. 30 manuscript samples were carefully cleaned to strip away the castor oil residue. 27 survived the process and were suitable for accurate radiocarbon dating. The results were already surprising. Some fragments were slightly younger than previously thought, but most were significantly older. That alone would have been enough to raise eyebrows. But the study did not stop there. The second step changed everything. Popovich and his colleagues developed an artificial intelligence model designed not to translate texts, not to interpret theology, but to read handwriting with a level of precision no human eye could match. They named it Enoch, after the biblical figure associated with wisdom and knowledge. The symbolism was intentional. This machine would not speak, it would observe. Enoch was trained using 62 high-resolution digital images taken from 24 scrolls that already had reliable radiocarbon dates. The AI learned to detect microscopic details in ink strokes, pressure patterns, curvature, consistency, stroke rhythm, variations too small for traditional paleography to quantify. Once trained, Enoch was tested on 13 new samples to verify accuracy. Then it was applied to 135 scrolls that had never been securely dated. The result was not speculation. In 79% of cases, paleographic experts reviewed Enoch's predictions and deemed them realistic. Not optimistic, not exaggerated, realistic. The AI did not compress history into fantasy, it refined it, and what it refined unsettled decades of assumption. Many scrolls were older than scholars believed, not by a few years, by 50, by 100, in some cases by 150 years. In ancient history, that is not a small adjustment. That is a generational shift. It changes who could have written a text, who could have copied it, who could have read it first, and suddenly, manuscripts long thought distant from their origins moved closer. Uncomfortably closer. One fragment made this impossible to ignore. Scroll 4, Q114, containing passages from the Book of Daniel, had traditionally been dated to the late 2nd century BCE based on handwriting style. Safe, conservative. Enoch disagreed. The AI placed it between 230 BCE and 160 BCE. That range overlaps with the lifetime of the presumed author. The study did not claim authorship. It did not cross that line. But it erased a barrier many scholars treated as fixed. The gap between composition and copy shrank, and once that gap shrinks, entire arguments built on distance begin to weaken. Popovich described the moment simply. He said a new door into the ancient world had opened, like a time machine. For the first time, scholars were studying the actual hands that wrote the Bible, not symbolic hands, physical ones. And for the first time, two biblical scroll fragments could be placed within the time of their presumed authors. That was not a claim of divine validation. It was a chronological correction. But the implications were enormous. While the AI was reshaping timelines in laboratories, something else was happening far from computers and journals. In 2021, archaeologists returned to the Judean desert, a place that many believed had already given up its secrets. They descended into a cave officially known as Cave 8, but remembered by another name, the Cave of Horror. The name was earned decades earlier. During the Bar Kokhba revolt around 35 CE, Jewish men, women, and children fled Roman forces and hid in this cave. Roman troops surrounded the area and camped above the cliff. There was no escape. The people inside refused to surrender. One by one, they died trapped, thirsty, and forgotten. Their skeletons were found where they fell, roughly 40 individuals. That history alone sealed the cave's reputation. By the early 1960s, explorers believed the site was exhausted, nothing left to find. But archaeology has a habit of rewarding patience. In 2021, a team from the Israel Antiquities Authority rappelled 80 meters down the cliff face to search again. The conditions were brutal: low light, thick dust, tight spaces. At first, they found nothing. Then someone noticed faint markings on what looked like debris, tiny scraps, barely worth noticing. But under closer inspection, those scraps revealed traces of ink. They were fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, small, brittle, almost missed, but enough to change the narrative again. In total, around 80 individual fragments were recovered. When researchers began piecing them together, they realized they belonged to the Scroll of the 12, also known as the Minor Prophets. Parts of this scroll had been discovered before in the early 1950s, sold by Bedouins in Jerusalem after being found near Nahal Hever. But these new fragments added something unfamiliar. They were written in Greek. That alone was unusual. Most biblical texts from the Judean desert are in Hebrew or Aramaic. Greek scrolls are rare in this region. More surprising was that the text did not match the standard Septuagint, the well-known Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It was related but different, a variant, a reworking, a deliberate version shaped by the community that used it. Two scribes were involved, each with a distinct handwriting style. The parchment texture matched earlier finds, confirming continuity. The content, however, pointed to diversity. Passages from the Book of Nahum describe divine judgment and power. Sections from Zechariah emphasized moral behavior, honesty, and rebuilding after exile. Familiar themes, but arranged and phrased in ways that suggested interpretation, not repetition. These fragments were too fragile for traditional analysis. That is where modern technology stepped in again. Each piece was scanned under visible, infrared, and ultraviolet light. Faint marks emerged. Letters that had almost vanished reappeared. Then AI-driven optical character recognition, designed specifically for ancient scripts, was applied. This was not modern OCR. It had been trained on ancient writing systems. It detected characters the human eye could barely distinguish. Once digitized, the fragments were fed into deep learning systems, trained on large collections of ancient manuscripts. The AI did more than recognize letters. It identified patterns, handwriting habits, scroll layout conventions, ink composition similarities. Slowly, something unexpected emerged. These scrolls were not the product of isolated scribes working alone. They showed signs of organized production, workshops, planning, even in times of crisis. Then the analysis went deeper. The AI began noticing variations in ink strokes that pointed beyond technique. Tiny tremors, uneven pressure, irregular rhythm. In one fragment from the Book of Nahum, the letters appeared rushed and jagged. At first glance, it looked careless. The AI disagreed. It detected micro tremors, consistent with an unsteady hand. Illness, fear, age, hiding. No one can say which. But the moment was preserved. A human reaction locked into ink. The scrolls stopped being static texts. They became frozen moments of survival. The cave revealed more than scrolls. Near the entrance, archaeologists uncovered the mummified remains of a child between 6 and 12 years old, carefully placed in a fetal position. Wrapped in cloth, hands holding fabric, the remains were dated to roughly 6,000 years ago. Deeper inside, a large woven basket was found. almost flawless, holding about 100 liters, dated to nearly 9,000 years ago, the oldest known basket ever discovered, from a time before pottery, before cities, before scripture. The cave was not just a hiding place. It was a layered record of human life, care, and survival across millennia. As AI continued analyzing scrolls from multiple caves, long-standing assumptions began to crack. For decades, many scholars believed the scrolls came from a single community, often linked to a group near Qumran, possibly the Essenes. But the evidence did not support isolation. Scrolls appeared in caves spread across the desert, written in multiple languages, using different scripts. Sacred names handled differently, corrections rushed, seams stitched quickly, as if time was running out. Some text variants found in the Cave of Horror did not exist in the Qumran collection at all. They matched readings closer to Jerusalem during Roman occupation. This suggested something far more complex. Not one group hiding texts, but multiple communities coordinating preservation during chaos. Scrolls passed hand to hand, carried across desert paths, hidden in caves, buried beside the dead. AI traced handwriting quirks, ink chemistry, parchment techniques, and confirmed what human eyes alone could not. This was not random. It was intentional preservation. Then came what was missing. Certain books never appeared. Esther, Chronicles, major texts in later tradition, absent. At the same time, Greek fragments revealed unfamiliar passages. Messianic emphasis softened. Community ethics strengthened. Some verses shifted tone from divine command to group consensus. These were not scribal mistakes. The changes were patterned and deliberate. What emerged was not a single religious archive. It was a conversation, competing beliefs, adaptation under pressure. Some groups looked toward salvation, others toward survival, others toward moral restructuring. Scripture was not frozen, it was moving. And this is where the AI-driven redating becomes crucial. Despite all the variation, despite all the edits, despite all the human fingerprints, the core text remained remarkably stable, especially once their dates moved closer to their origins. The AI did not undermine Scripture. It tightened its timeline. It showed that key biblical texts were circulating earlier than many scholars had assumed, that copies existed closer to the events they describe. That transmission was faster, more careful, more urgent. For believers, this reinforces trust. For historians, it demands reevaluation. Either way, the past just became sharper. Popovich believes Enoch's potential extends far beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls. The same methods can date manuscripts without destroying them. No more wide margins, no more educated guessing, just patterns, hands, ink. A new way of listening to history. The scrolls waited 2,000 years. Now machines are finally catching up. And what they are revealing is not chaos, not fabrication, not myth unraveling. It is something quieter, more unsettling, more solid. The Bible's story was not written late. It was not stitched together carelessly. It was carried forward by people who knew exactly what they were holding. People who hid it because they believed it mattered. The only question left is whether we are ready to read it without the filters we built. Because once artificial intelligence learns to hear ancient hands, the past stops whispering. It speaks, and that voice carries an uncomfortable weight. Because what the AI has ultimately done is not confirm one side and dismiss another. It has removed distance. It has collapsed time. And when distance disappears, interpretation changes. The Dead Sea Scrolls no longer sit safely far away from the people and events they describe. They press closer, close enough to challenge long-held academic caution, close enough to unsettle arguments built on delay, drift, and distortion. For years, critics argued that biblical texts were copied too late to reflect original belief, that layers of editing separated authors from manuscripts, that what survived was more tradition than testimony. The new dating does not erase human involvement. It does not deny revision, debate, or variation. The scrolls still show disagreement. They still show adaptation. But what they no longer support is the idea that these writings were distant inventions of later centuries. The window between origin and preservation has narrowed, in some cases, dramatically. That matters because ancient cultures did not preserve texts casually. Writing was labor, ink was effort, parchment was costly. No one copied words they did not value, and no one risked hiding them in caves, sealing them beside the dead, or carrying them across hostile terrain unless they believed those words carried authority. The scrolls show fear, urgency, and care. They show scribes writing under pressure, correcting quickly, stitching parchment in haste. They show belief in motion, not myth in construction. The Dead Sea Scrolls are no longer silent witnesses buried in desert caves. Through AI, they have become timed voices, anchored voices. They tell us that Scripture was not assembled in comfort, but carried through crisis. Not polished in peace, but protected in fear. And not written centuries removed from belief, but preserved dangerously close to it. History often changes not with loud discoveries, but with small corrections that shift everything around them. 50 years here, 100 years there. Enough to redraw timelines, enough to reopen debates thought settled, enough to force both scholars and believers to look again. The scrolls waited, the caves held, the ink endured. And now with machines listening where eyes once failed, the ancient world is no longer as distant as we thought.